On December 14, 1943, in a windowless conference room at Pearl Harbor, Pacific Fleet Commander Chester Nimitz sat at the center of the long table. Outside, Hawaii's eternal sunshine and blue waters gleamed, but the air inside felt frozen solid. Even the hum of the air conditioning seemed piercingly loud. To his right sat Vice Admiral Raymond Spruance, the hero of Midway, now with brows deeply furrowed. To his left were Rear Admiral Richard Connolly, and beside Turner sat Lieutenant General Holland Smith, the fierce Marine commander whose face was equally grim today. These three were the top commanders of the U.S. Pacific Theater, yet they unanimously opposed Nimitz's battle plan. Spruance spoke first, his tone steady but unmistakable. "This plan is too risky. Our fleet will be exposed to unpredictable dangers." Turner followed, his voice even sharper, calling it reckless, tantamount to gambling with soldiers' lives. Holland Smith agreed, saying they should first capture the outer islands, advance steadily, push toward Malo Elipand Arno step by step, and absolutely not attack Kwajalein at all directly. The timing was wrong. A direct assault would only increase casualties. The three generals were remarkably united, and the atmosphere in the room grew unbearably heavy. Yet no one knew that Nimitz, sitting across from them, had already made an unshakable decision in his heart. Just 3 weeks earlier, he had witnessed a living hell, an experience that had fundamentally changed his judgment. On November 20th, 1943, American forces launched a landing operation on Betio Island in the Tarawa atoll. This tiny island was only 2 kilometers long and half a kilometer wide, taking just 5 minutes to cross by car, yet it was garrisoned by nearly 5,000 elite troops. Before the battle, no one could have predicted that this speck of land would become one of the most brutal battlefields of the Pacific War. Yet on this minuscule island, over 1,000 American soldiers fell dead in 76 hours of bloody fighting, and more than 2,000 were wounded. The entire beach was stained red with blood, and the seawater floated with broken equipment and fallen warriors. On November 27th, when Nimitz set foot on Betio, the bodies of fallen soldiers had not yet been fully buried. He walked the entire island on foot. Where coral reefs once dotted the flat landscape, now everything was devastated. Before the battle, Betio had been a flat island covered with coral reefs, dotted with concrete bunkers, coconut groves, and artillery positions, garrisoned by nearly 5,000 troops. After the battle, nothing on the island stood higher than a man's chest. All trees were destroyed, buildings collapsed or burned to the ground. The relentless bombardment had churned the ground beyond recognition, many areas of sand blackened by fire, and beneath the earth lay countless dead. In 30 years of naval service, Nimitz had seen countless post-battle horrors, yet he still could not face the scene before him. The soldiers responsible for burying the dead had been working continuously for 4 days, still severely understaffed. Many bodies could only be buried collectively with bulldozers because there was simply no time for individual burials. The entire island was barely 2 miles long. No matter where you walked, you could not escape this grim aftermath. The air was filled with an indescribable stench of decay. Shell casings and shattered equipment littered the sun-scorched sand. Occasionally, a military boot could be seen half buried in the earth. He did not extensively record what he saw. Some grief simply cannot be captured in words. But standing on that beach, Nimitz grasped a truth that the High Command in Washington could never truly understand. The soldiers' sacrifice was not due to lack of courage, but a tragic miscalculation of the tides. According to the landing plan, the water depth above the reef at the time of attack should have reached 5 feet, enough for Higgins' flat-bottomed landing craft to cross the coral reef and reach the beach. But November 20th, 1943 happened to coincide with one of the year's only 2 neap tides. The water level dropped significantly. The reef was only 3 feet below the surface, and some areas were even shallower. This fatal miscalculation caused the entire landing plan to collapse instantly. The landing craft ran aground 800 yards from shore, and the Marines aboard looked at each other, then realized they were wrapped in a desperate situation. The Marines had no choice but to disembark and wade forward under withering fire. The water first rose to their chests, then dropped to their waists, then to their knees. For 800 yards they were fully exposed to a hail of bullets. Some were hit and fell, their bodies sinking beneath the water only to be pushed back to the surface by the waves, blood spreading through the seawater. Those immobile landing craft floated on the open coast, continuously raked by machine gun fire until they sank or caught fire. The soldiers aboard had to either jump into deep water to survive or go down with their vessels. 125 amphibious tracked vehicles had been deployed for this operation, the only vehicles capable of crossing the reef. Yet, on the first day of battle, these vehicles were almost entirely lost. The enemy's artillery fire was precise and lethal. Shells repeatedly struck the bunkers but could barely dent them. Tarawa's defeat lay in tactical planning, not in the courage of the troops. Every soldier who fell on that shallow beach knew this. After returning to Pearl Harbor from Betio, Nimitz faced mountains of accusatory letters. His aide, Hal Lamar, who managed office affairs, had initially wanted to set these letters aside. He knew Nimitz bore the immense operational pressure of the entire Pacific theater and should not have to endure the accusations of grieving families. But Nimitz insisted on handling them personally, reading each letter one by one. The letters came from small towns in Ohio, farms in Georgia, and from the streets of Boston, Pittsburgh, and San Diego. Those young men who had once played baseball in their hometowns had gone to the Pacific battlefield and never returned. The words in the letters were blunt and sorrowful. "You killed my child. What was the point of it all?" Some letters contained only a single line. Others filled entire pages with handwriting so shaky it was clearly written through tears. Nimitz did not use a standard reply template, instead writing personal responses to each one. He carefully considered every word in each letter, knowing that for families who had lost loved ones, any form letter would be a desecration. He confessed to his aide that he was trapped in endless torment, praying devoutly for the war to end soon, for the killing and wounding to stop. He also visited field hospitals, moving through the wards, sitting beside amputees and soldiers bearing unspeakable wounds. Some patients recognized him and struggled to salute, others simply stared at the commander, their eyes holding both resentment and understanding. He went to the bedside of a dying 19-year-old soldier, telling him he was proud of him and that the entire nation honored him. The soldier passed away with a smile on his face. Nimitz walked out of the ward, and the next day returned to his desk to continue issuing combat orders. No one knew whether he had slept that night, but the man who appeared in the command room the next morning was the same calm and decisive commander. History books rarely fully depict the dilemma Nimitz faced at that time. He knew the strategic decision to take Tarawa was not wrong. The mistake lay in tactical execution. Tarawa's airfield and base were the essential stepping stone to the Marshall Islands. Taking the Marshall Islands was necessary to advance to the Mariana Islands. And taking the Mariana Islands was the only way for B-29 bombers to reach the skies above Tokyo. This chain of strategic imperatives was indispensable, each step determining the course of the war. The only question now was how to minimize casualties while continuing to fight, how to take the next island and get more soldiers home alive. This was the question that consumed Nimitz. He knew that if he followed the general's advice to attack the outer islands first, the war would drag into a prolonged war of attrition. The enemy would use the time to strengthen Kwajalelin's defenses, and the cost of attacking later would only be greater. He did not need a safer plan, he needed a smarter one. And smart plans often meant taking risks, meant insisting on your own judgment when everyone else said it could not be done. In November 1943, the U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff approved the Central Pacific offensive route, targeting the Marshall Islands. This was one of the most critical strategic decisions of the Pacific War, determining how American forces would cross the vast Pacific and press toward the Japanese homeland. However, on the main direction of attack, Nimitz and his three top generals had a serious disagreement. Spruance, Turner, and Holland Smith unanimously advocated first capturing the Eastern Marshall Islands outposts of Malo Elip, WOTCG, and Arno. Their reasons were sound. Kwajalein Atoll was the enemy command center in the Marshall Islands, with the strongest defenses and the largest garrison. Attacking Kwajalein directly would be like throwing eggs against a stone. They should first eliminate the flanks before going for the core. Turner produced detailed intelligence analysis showing Kwajalein at all held nearly 10,000 troops, with about 5,000 defenders on Kwajalein Island itself and over 3,000 on Royan Amur. Such formidable defensive forces would be difficult for existing American landing forces to break through quickly. The outer islands had weaker garrisons. Capturing them first would establish forward bases and accumulate experience for subsequent operations. Spruance raised concerns from a naval perspective. The lagoon entrance to Kwajalein Atoll was narrow. If the enemy laid mines or sank ships to block the channel, the American fleet would be trapped in a dilemma. Holland Smith, as the ground commander, was most concerned about landing for casualties. The bloody lesson of Tarawa was still fresh. He would never allow his soldiers to die needlessly on coral reefs again. Attacking the outer islands first and advancing steadily was the safest approach. The three generals' arguments were reasonable, and nearly all military advisors stood on their side. The meeting lasted for hours, with both sides repeatedly clashing, neither able to convince the other. Yet Nimitz made a decision that shocked everyone to attack Kwajalein directly. His reasons were equally compelling. First, while the enemy core defense at Kwajalein was strong, the outer island garrisons were not negligible either. Capturing the outer islands one by one would not only be time-consuming, but would give the enemy ample time to strengthen Kwajalein's defenses. Every additional day of delay gave the enemy one more day to fortify their positions and redeploy troops. Second, after Tarawa, American forces had accumulated valuable amphibious combat experience, and troop combat effectiveness and morale were at their peak. This was the optimal time to attack, and any delay would only see that advantage erode. Third, and most critically, Nimitz had distilled 5 core improvement measures from Tarawa's bitter lessons. He firmly believed these improvements would make the Kwajalein battle fundamentally different from Tarawa. The conference room fell silent. No one could refute these reasons, but no one truly believed that a few improvements could turn the tide of battle. Ultimately, Nimitz used his authority as Pacific Fleet commander to make the final decision, and the Battle of Kwajalein was thus set. When the meeting adjourned, the three generals left silently. They respected Nimitz's decision, but their concerns had not diminished in the slightest. The first improvement was precise tidal and hydrographic reconnaissance. The root cause of Tarawa's tragedy was the tidal miscalculation, and Nimitz would never allow the same mistake to happen again. He ordered hydrographic reconnaissance units to conduct comprehensive surveys of target waters before the landing, precisely mastering the depth of every reef, the course of every channel, ensuring landing craft could pass through the correct tidal window. The second improvement was overwhelming fire preparation. Tarawa's naval bombardment had lasted 3 hours, but failed to effectively destroy enemy bunkers. Nimitz demanded significantly increased fire preparation time and ammunition expenditure for the Kwajalein operation, while also introducing naval carrier aircraft for precision strikes, ensuring every known enemy fortification was thoroughly destroyed before the landing. The third improvement was more sufficient troop commitment. American forces had been stretched thin at Tarawa, so Nimitz assembled a much larger amphibious force this time, ensuring overwhelming numerical superiority at every landing point. The fourth improvement was underwater demolition and obstacle clearance. He formed specialized underwater demolition teams to infiltrate coastal waters before the landing, clearing underwater obstacles and creating safe passages for the landing forces. These frogmen deployed from small boats ahead of the landing forces, sometimes in daylight, sometimes under fire, surveying reef topography, marking navigable channels, clearing underwater obstacles, preventing landing forces from encountering unexpected hazards in the dark. The fifth improvement was comprehensive upgrading of landing vehicles. The amphibious tracked vehicles were reinforced, modified, and mass-produced with armor and firepower significantly enhanced. Regardless of tidal conditions, they could now carry the first wave of landing troops smoothly across the reef. Each of these 5 improvements was written in the blood of Tarawa's fallen, lessons purchased with lives. In the Kwajalein campaign, there was another commander who made an even bolder breakthrough based on these lessons. Rear Admiral Richard Connolly, commanding the Northern Attack Force, was responsible for capturing the twin islands of Roy Namur. Connolly was not a flashy, famous general who rarely made newspaper headlines, but he had engineer's meticulous mind. Among naval commanders, he was an outlier, not pursuing elegant tactics, but only the most effective results. He held a simple but firm belief that bunkers could never be completely destroyed by long-range shelling. Shells fired from 2,000 yards away came in at a steep angle, mostly hitting only the top or outer walls of bunkers, rarely causing fatal damage. Only close-range fire could send shells in a nearly flat trajectory, striking the front wall of a bunker directly and penetrating the fortification through sheer impact force. This theory was almost unheard of in the Navy, where battleships prided themselves on long-range gunnery. Driving a warship worth tens of millions of dollars into the range of enemy coastal artillery was tantamount to madness. But Connolly did not care what others thought. He cared about how to get fewer Marines killed. On the afternoon of February 1st, 1944, Connolly decided to put this tactic into practice. At 12:12 p.m., he issued an order to the battleship Maryland, close with the beach at full speed this afternoon. Use main and secondary guns for direct fire. Suppress enemy coastal artillery and bunkers. In a Navy that prized professional terminology and standard communications, such a blunt order was striking. The battleships Maryland and Mississippi obeyed and advanced, ultimately anchoring just 1,500 yards, less than 1 mile from the enemy shore. Completely within range of enemy coastal artillery and modified anti-aircraft guns, sailors on board could see the shore with the naked eye. Watching through gun sights as 14-inch guns shattered coconut trees one by one. Those bunkers that had survived 2 days of conventional bombardment collapsed one after another under the close-range fire. The defenders inside no longer merely shaken by shells, but facing lethal strikes directly. From then on, Richard Connolly earned a nickname that would stay with him for the rest of his life, Close in Connolly. He was willing to put his warships in danger only to reduce Marine casualties. All commanders understood the trade-off, but actually taking action required tremendous courage. Facing enemy fire for the sake of comrades on the beach, before dawn on January 31st, 1944, the landing operation officially began. In the darkness, soldiers of the 7th Infantry Division paddled rubber boats silently toward for tiny islands at the southern end of the atoll. The sea was calm as a mirror, only the sound of paddles and the occasional distant gunfire breaking the night's silence. Soldiers gripped their rifles tightly, their heartbeats nearly drowning out the sound of the waves. The defenses on these islands were weak, garrisoned mostly by trainees, ground crews, and other logistics personnel who had never expected ground combat. By nightfall, all 4 small islands had been captured by American forces with virtually no meaningful resistance. Before midnight, the 145th Field Artillery Battalion had set up howitzers on Carlson Island, soldiers using flashlights to complete fire alignment against Kwajalein's main island. North of the atoll, the 25th Marines also captured 5 small islands smoothly, their guns trained on Roy Namur. At this point, American forces had established a complete fire encirclement around Kwajalein Atoll, waiting only for the moment of the main assault. On the morning of February 1st, 1944, 3 days of naval bombardment combined with all shore-based firepower unleashed simultaneously. Battleships, cruisers, destroyers, Army artillery on the islands, and carrier-based aircraft from Task Force 58 all opened fire in a coordinated assault. On this single day, 36,000 shells rained down on this island to under half miles long and barely half a mile wide. More shells per square yard than any previous Pacific battle. Over 7,000 defenders on Kwajalein's main island were wrapped in a firestorm with nowhere to escape. The defenders had built their defenses facing the open sea, all fortifications oriented outward, never expecting the Americans to attack from the lagoon side inside the atoll. When American landing forces surged onto the beaches from the lagoon side, the coastal defenses they had painstakingly built were almost useless, their guns pointing in the wrong direction. The battle progressed far more smoothly than anyone had anticipated. Roy Namur was captured on February 2nd, and Kwajalein's main island fell on February 4th. The entire campaign's progress was weeks ahead of Nimitz's estimates, a result that left all the skeptical generals speechless. Turner, who had opposed most fiercely, had to admit that Nimitz's judgment had been correct. At Tarawa, the garrison was 4,500 and American deaths exceeded 1,000. At Kwajalein, the Japanese force was double, yet American deaths were less than a third of Tarawa's. This comparison was itself the most powerful proof that Nimitz's 5 improvements and Connolly's close-in tactics had truly played a decisive role. Before the battle, the American staff had analyzed Tarawa's casualty data and Kwajalein's fortification density, concluding that the Kwajalein campaign would take longer and cost more lives. Yet the final result far exceeded expectations. Nimitz had originally estimated the campaign would last until mid-February, but the overall progress was weeks ahead of schedule. On February 5th, 1944, Nimitz flew back to the newly captured island. As was his custom, he went ashore to inspect before engineers had finished clearing, but this time what he saw was not a living hell like Tarawa, but an island being efficiently cleared and rebuilt. Subsequently, interrogating prisoners yielded intelligence that in Nivitok Atoll, 400 miles to the northwest, had Japanese garrisons and defenses weaker than estimated. Now was the perfect window to attack before Japanese reinforcements could arrive. This time, Nimitz held no meetings, organized no discussions, and directly ordered Spruance to use Kwajalein's reserve forces to attack in Nivitok immediately. The operation originally scheduled for May was moved up to February, a full 3 months ahead of schedule. Spruance, who just 2 months earlier had strongly opposed any reckless advance, this time raised not a single objection and firmly executed the order. Kwajalein's victory had already proven Nimitz's judgment correct. On February 21st, Nivitok was successfully captured, and the Pacific battlefield's advance far exceeded Washington's expectations. On September 2nd, 1945, Japan officially signed the Instrument of Surrender, and World War II came to an end. Throughout the entire Pacific War, the Battle of Kwajalein never made the front pages, while Kwajalein, won too smoothly, was gradually forgotten by history. Tarawa, Guadalcanal, Okinawa, and other bloody battles with heavy casualties were remembered by the world and became part of the national memory. History always focuses on the battlefields with the heaviest casualties and the bitterest costs, as if only blood can prove a battle's worth. But those American soldiers who rest forever at Kwajalein were never cold statistics. Their sacrifice was equally heavy, their courage equally worthy of remembrance. They were someone's son, husband, or father, ordinary young men who grew up during the Great Depression, who milked cows on farms, turned screws in factories, and played football on campus. They answered their nation's call and traveled across the ocean, fulfilling their military duty on a Pacific atoll that most Americans could not find on a map. If you have an elder in your family who served in the Pacific Theater, a relative who boarded ships from San Diego or San Francisco after Pearl Harbor, They may have been part of the Kwajalein campaign. They might have been stationed on the island, sailing on a ship in the lagoon, flying sorties in the airspace, or waiting on a transport vessel amid gunfire and smoke. That generation of veterans rarely spoke of the past, not because they had nothing to say, but because some horrors and shocks cannot be described in everyday language. They tucked their memories away in their hearts, not as a heavy burden, but as a life-changing experience. Many stories exist only in the minds of those who lived them, never put to paper, only occasionally mentioned to a spouse late at night, or to an old comrade reunited after years. When the last witnesses pass away, these stories will vanish completely. If you have heard an elder in your family tell of these experiences, even just fragments, consider writing them down. These soldiers' achievements should not remain only in the annals of famous bloody battles. The forgotten Kwajalein deserves to be remembered forever. And all the momentous historical decisions Nimitz made after Tarawa were the greatest tribute to those fallen soldiers and the most profound answer to that weighty chapter of history. If you want more untold stories of the Pacific War's boldest commanders and the decisions that shaped history, smash that like button and subscribe. I am your battlefield observer, and I will see you on the next front.